Today we're going to talk about constitutional powers and federalism. The first thing we need to talk about are different types of powers that are identified within the Constitution. The first are enumerated powers, and then the second are implied powers. Enumerated powers are powers that are explicitly written in the Constitution. These are things that were written by the framers and that we understand just by reading. An example of this is in Article 1, it says that Congress has the power to declare war. Implied powers are very different than enumerated powers. These are powers that are not actually written in the Constitution, but you can infer them from what is written and what the intent was. Sometimes this is called the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. The idea here is you can read it and understand it as being true. An example of this would be in Article 1, it says that Congress can raise armies and can declare war. But it doesn't mention anything about paying those military personnel, training the military personnel, but we understand that those are necessities if you're going to have a successful military. So the implied power would be that the military can be trained and paid. The enumerated power would be that they can raise a military and that they can declare war. We're going to shift gears now a little bit to something called federalism. And federalism is this idea of dividing power between state governments and the national government. And the reason that they did this was because after the Articles of Confederation went into place, it became obvious that the states had too much power and the national government had very little power at all. So now we're going to talk about the three types of powers that are established through federalism. The first is delegated powers, the second reserved powers, and the third are concurrent powers. Delegated powers are those powers that are given specifically and only to the national government. You can see a list here. These are written in the Constitution that the national government can declare war, maintain armed forces, regulate interstate and foreign trade, admit new states, establish post offices, set standards, weights, and measures, coin money, establish foreign policy, and make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out delegated powers. State powers are called reserved powers. These are reserved only for the states, and they are to establish and maintain schools, establish local governments, regulate business within the state, make marriage laws, provide for public safety, and assume other powers not delegated to the national governments or prohibited to the states. And we'll come back to that last one again. And then finally, the powers that they both share are called concurrent powers. These things are maintain law and order, levy taxes, borrow money, charter banks, establish courts, and provide for public welfare. All of these things we will talk more in detail about when we move into our next unit. So what happens if a power is not granted in the Constitution? According to the 10th Amendment, and remember the Bill of Rights were added in order to get states to ratify the Constitution. In the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is saying that if the Constitution does not explicitly say these powers are given to somebody, then it automatically goes to the states. And the framers included this because they knew that as time went by, if they wanted this to be a long-lasting constitution, they would have to put in different mechanisms to make sure that as these new issues and these new debates over power arose, that they would have a mechanism in place, like states taking over those powers because they're not already given to the national government. And this also kind of helps to settle some issues between the state and the national government in balancing that power. What happens if a state creates a law that contradicts a federal law? Well, the framers thought about that too. In Article 6, they state the Supremacy Clause. This says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." Basically saying that the national government is the supreme of the two. So if a state creates a law that contradicts the federal law is the one that wins out between the two. So this is called the Supremacy Clause. What responsibilities do states have to each other? So there are two things listed here. Both of them are located in Article 4. The first one is the Full Faith and Credit Clause, Article 4, Section 1. It says, full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, record, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So that means that every state has access to the other's records, public records. But also, if you have somebody who's committed a crime in one state and they flee to another, the state that they have fled to has the responsibility to send that person back to the state where they committed the crime. And this is called extradition. So we have extradition agreements with other countries as well, but we understand that from state to state, they have to abide by that and they have to send that person back to the state where they committed the crime. The next responsibility is called the Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is Article 4, Section 2. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. This is saying that if you were to visit another state and you broke a law, you would be treated the same way as a citizen of that state. You're not going to be treated differently because you're a citizen from another state. This also applies to transference of laws. So, for example, if you decide you wanted to have a destination wedding and you travel to Florida to get married on the beach and you come back, you don't have to have another wedding ceremony. You're still married, even if you got married in a different state. Driving laws are kind of the same way. If you're going on a road trip, you don't have to stop and take a road test every state you travel through. Your one road test that you took here in Alabama now applies to these other states. Now, I will say that some states do have different laws for people who are under the age of 18, so you may have to redo some of that depending on those laws. But as long as you're an adult and you have that driver's license, if you got it in one state, it's still good in every state. So you're given the same privileges and same immunities as the citizens of other states. What responsibilities does the federal government have to the states? Well, Article 4, Section 4 states that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So this is saying that it's the responsibility of the federal government to protect the states from not only foreign invasion or foreign attack, but also from domestic attacks as well. What is the financial obligation of the federal government to the states? And this is what we call fiscal federalism. You've read it in your textbook as well. And this is the idea that the federal government has primarily used money as a way to implement policy. If the federal government creates a new law and wants to ensure that it's being implemented across the United States, oftentimes they will attach some money to it. These are called grants and aid. There are different types of grants. The first type of grant is called a categorical grant. This is a grant and aid provided to states with specific provisions on their use and have strict conditions attached. Underneath categorical grants, there are two other types of grants. One is a project grant. This is usually the type of grant that someone who works at a major university would apply for a specific project or for specific research. And then a formula grant, and these are grants that money is given based on a particular formula for the population, how many people within that population are in need, and then that particular formula would be applied and that amount of money would be set aside. And then the second type of grant is a block grant. These are federal grants given more or less automatically to states or communities to support broad programs in areas such as community development and social services. Unfortunately, for a lot of states, They also experience these unfunded federal mandates, and the federal government can create laws and don't necessarily have to attach money to it. Sometimes they can just say, this is the law and you have to do it, and may not provide the funding for those states to implement those things. And the states still are obligated to follow those laws. So this then leads us into a topic that is mentioned in the textbook, and a lot of times students kind of get confused about the analogy of layered cake versus a marble cake. So we're going to take a minute to look at that and discuss. There are two types of federalism: dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Dual federalism is usually represented by a layered cake, as you can see on the left. These are programs and authority are clearly divided among the national, state, and local governments and have very little interference with each other. We saw a lot of dual federalism, more so when our country was first created, because everything kind of ran separately. You had the powers that the federal government had, and they kind of did those independently. And then you had the powers that the state governments had, and they also kind of functioned independently. Today, though, we see more of this cooperative federalism, especially after the Great Depression and the New Deal. We definitely see an expanse in this. And now we have a lot of these programs that are kind of intermixed with each other and very difficult to separate. So we sometimes call this the marble cake federalism. And these are programs and authority are mixed among the national, state, and local governments, and they are very difficult to separate. You may now continue to your next step in the lesson.